I want to point out again how the traditional forms, the structures, and the architecture of music are able to contain and control Beethoven's astounding new ideas. And no matter how far he pushes the envelope, the basic pillars of tonal harmony, the tonic and the dominant, they hold it all together. That massive arch of music near the end of the first movement, with the horns playing and the dashing violin scales, almost entirely based on the polarity of tonic and dominant, alternating, rotating, revolving, the fundamental axis of tonal harmony. And the more complex Beethoven's language becomes, the more powerful these fundamental harmonies remain. Now, having said all of that, Beethoven surprises everybody by starting this finale on a unison D, which is a little disoriented if you're supposed to be in the key of E flat major. But this tempestuous introduction you will hear, it quickly works its way around to a big B flat dominant seventh chord, which must resolve, of course, and it will, after this grandiose theatrical buildup. Beethoven is obviously setting the stage for some monumental main theme to make its appearance, with all of and here it is. Well, this certainly doesn't seem to be, but I was about to say that. Just a side note here. This finale is not a sonata movement, it's a theme and variations, which is a real change of pace and a form which Beethoven was very fond of. And that's the theme you just heard there that warranted all of this fireworks, the big buildup. This, it's a theme, I suppose it is. It's just barely a theme. But how do you write variations now on a theme that is practically nothing? Well, we'll see what Beethoven has up his sleeve. And you heard the beginning of the first variation there. Beethoven adds a bit of counterpoint to this theme, like so. And variation 2 continues in the same way, strings only, but with more active counterpoint, like so. Etc. And lovely string harmonies at the close of the variation. And in the third variation, the counterpoint in the violins becomes even more florid and whatnot. And all this is very nice, it's very lovely, but it is here in this third variation that we suddenly realize that this silly thing that we've been listening to for the last 3 minutes is not the theme. It is not the theme of the finale. There's another melody that's been waiting in the wings to make its entrance, and it is this. And this is actually the bass line that accompanies that theme, like so. It's like, okay, all right, now I get it. Now I understand what he's been doing. Here is this grand moment now when we realize that we've been had. So there is our theme. And I think of the brilliant program notes by Philip Huscher, who writes for the Chicago Symphony. He said at one point that the appearance of this theme here, late, is like an elegant hostess who comes floating in fashionably late to her own party, which I think is a perfect metaphor for this. And Beethoven gets a lot of mileage out of this melody. He has already used it 3 times prior to this symphony. He used it in his Prometheus ballet, it was one of his ballroom contradances, and he used it in his EROICA variations for piano. So this would be his final statement on this favorite melody of his. But before we go on, I want to mention a few things to keep in mind. First, the theme and variations form is something of a musical fantasy, as we know from our episode on it. So to create a cohesive structure now for a symphonic finale is really quite a challenge that Beethoven has set for himself, especially because of the simplicity of the material and the fact that the theme itself is based only on the tonic and dominant harmonies. Tonic, dominant, dominant, and it's about as primitive harmonically as you could possibly get. Also, the theme is in 2 parts. It's structured like so. The first part we know. But the second half is this. All based on the dominant chord, the whole thing. And it features that little ascending scale, which will now lead to a new transition. G major. And our next variation now is a fugue in C minor, which uses the bass line as its subject, like so. So we get its perfect Baroque-inspired counterpoint. More voices enter, and the texture becomes more complex, and Beethoven, as he so often does, takes a tiny motive. Now this is tiny enough as it is, these 4 notes, right? How could he extract anything from it? But he does. He takes the 2nd and 3rd notes, this one, and this one. He just takes those 2, and this is his new little motive. And it happens to be an octave, and he begins to build on it. So there's lots going on under all of this, but the violins are now playing this simple octave motive like so. Now he speeds it up, double time. Ooh, and we've arrived unexpectedly in the key of B minor. Rather wistful. Now there's a delicate variation in D major for violins and oboes, and a sparkly little etude for the solo flute. And things are clearly heating up again as we plunge into our next variation with the 4-note motive now pounded out in the bass. And a rousing Hungarian-style marching song. Beethoven is really on fire now, and you heard ringing out in the violins. Now we have a brief time out in C major, leading to another fugue, another fugal passage. This one begins very, very softly, scherzando, and it uses an inversion of the bass line motive like so. And there you heard the flutes add the main theme like so, in a new rhythmic form. And again, Beethoven will now use that octave figure to sort of build momentum throughout his structure, like so. And we have a massive, extended buildup now. The old Mannheim school could never have imagined an orchestral crescendo of this kind of power, entirely built on the dominant chord. And we will come to rest on this chord, this dominant seventh chord, we call it, just as Beethoven had done in the finales of his first two symphonies. You may recall back in the end of the first symphony, and coming out of the fermata, the hold, we had this. Near the end of the second symphony, same thing, comes to rest on the same chord. Then, that very mysterious march. You'll remember that when you review those episodes. This always comes at the same, like a major structural point near the end of the finales for Beethoven in all three of these symphonies, this massive dominant seventh chord. And now in the third symphony, this huge chord. Listen to where this one leads. A lovely lyrical variation, the emotional heart of this finale, probably of the entire symphony. And it's scored for the woodwinds and horns, as you heard, which recalls the radiant sound of Mozart's wind serenades. And it's positioned in just the right place in the finale's overall structure. Now the strings take up the theme, and Beethoven increases the warmth and intensity of the music with these harmonies. And that ascending figure from the theme's second half will now lift this music to new heights. Back in the first movement of the second symphony, near the end, you recall that passage that I highlighted in such great detail, that great harmonic passage where we saw and experience the intensity that is created by what we call harmonic suspensions, this sort of thing. They have sort of a liturgical feel to them, but it's very, very intense. And here, in this most exquisite moment, for me, of this entire third symphony, it comes when Beethoven uses this one suspended chord in this passage. Here it is. It's as if the entire emotional weight of this symphony, which contains very little lyrical music throughout, rests on this one lovely passage and this one super intense harmonic event. And I'm sure I'm in a minority of one on this, since you rarely ever notice this in performance. I mean, most conductors don't even pay attention. They just go straight through it. It comes late in the symphony. Everybody wants to quit and go home. I understand it. But I sure am glad that Beethoven wrote it. I really am. Just after the oboe rises to the high point of the phrase with this. Again, it's very brief. At any rate, now the loveliness continues. Again, the graceful sound of the wind serenade with clarinet arpeggios. And all of what is coming now is a transformation of the theme's second half, all built on the dominant harmony. It is all that. So this gorgeous fantasy serenade continues basically on this one dominant chord. The accompaniment is intricately woven together. The low strings take up the triplet arpeggios like so, while the three horns and the bassoons in their low register play duplet figures, interlocking with the cellos and bass, like so. Interlocking with the cellos and bass, and did I say cellies? But it's celli, we all know that. And the violins above it play these delicate little fanfares. Here is how it all fits together. And this merges into a grandiose, almost pompous version of the main theme, played by the full orchestra, which signals that we are, of course, approaching the symphony's final moments. And now we have something of a little intermezzo here, almost pastoral in tone, and it starts in the key of A flat major, like so. Etc., etc. Very easygoing, deceptively easy going. And soon the triumphant character of that previous variation begins to give way to something very, very different. Beethoven sets up this nice flowing triplet rhythm in the strings, like so. It is very comforting, and yet it still has a vaguely disquieting resemblance to this passage from the second movement, Funeral March. In fact, it seems clear that Beethoven is now recalling the darkness and the weight of the second movement here, snatching defeat from the jaws of victory, it seems. And he takes these three repeated notes from the finale's main theme, which we know so well, but he uses them now to slowly overwhelm the music like so. With the triplet motion in between, building lots of intensity. And all of this moves now into these monumental harmonies. Leading to this solemn, fateful sounding cadence. And I thought we were headed for a triumphant conclusion here. Well, and remember, there was that ghostly pulsating figure way back in the Funeral March. This. Well, the triumphant resolution now of this finale that seemed so close just a few minutes ago has now become this. It's so pathetic. It's so feeble. The life just seems to have gone out of the music at this point. But this, again, is the brilliance of Beethoven's structural and dramatic plan, this panoramic vision of doom that comes so close to the end of the symphony. Because now, if you will recall the beginning of this finale, that big unison D, that led us into that momentary tempest? Well, it might have seemed like a bit of overkill at the time, especially with that goofy theme that followed. But now, this passage returns now for a coda, starting on a big unison G, etc. And now it makes total sense, since it obliterates all traces of the funereal gloom. And I hate to keep going on about this, or they do, but again, Beethoven limits himself entirely to the repetition of two chords. Now, the tonic E flat major and the dominant B flat chord, the fundamental axis of tonality. And no composer in history could design and construct and sustain such magnificent vistas of sound based on these two elemental chords. And this coda now is the final variation of our theme. Okay, which Beethoven now compresses into one measure of tonic and one measure of dominant. It's a rollicking folk song. It's a thrilling marching tune. It's whatever you want it to be, something so joyous that it barely can contain its own energy. And every two measures now, Beethoven begins to subdivide the rhythmic units to increase the intensity, like so. Which becomes ba 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 bum bum, which becomes ba 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 da ba ba ba, and then ba 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 da ba da da. All tonic, all dominant, all the time, which finally now coalesces into a pure, bold, and brilliant E flat major. Just one chord now for the very end, the fundamental tonic, and there's fanfares and there's scales and there's flourishes throughout the whole orchestra. Nothing but E flat major, an arch of such titanic force that it bursts the limits and the conventions of the musical language of the time. This is Beethoven's heroic style, so often associated with the revolutionary spirit of the time, as embodied in the person of Napoleon, at least initially for Beethoven. But think about this. Napoleon's historic achievements, his accomplishments, his conquests, his influence, all were ultimately swept aside by the tides of history. Whereas Beethoven's monumental achievement, this symphony, is still with us. Every single note of it. I'm Lawrence Rapchak, and thank you very much for watching.